All right, thank you very much to the organizers for this great conference. This is a new project, so I look forward to discussion and comments. Historians often struggle to recapture the silenced voices of the past. Minorities and marginalized groups lack access not only to education, but also to the archival repositories needed to record and preserve their stories. Jews were a peculiar case in this regard, for their communities enjoyed comparatively high levels of literacy. However, their writings became the object of intense surveillance in the 16th century. In 1557, Josefa Cohen, an Italian Jew in his early 60s, wrote a 600-page book in Hebrew on the Americas. He was the second Jew to mention the New World in writing and the first to pen a book about it. The book's scope was far-reaching. It included mention of Columbus and Cortez, discussion of Spanish and global politics, detailed description of the New World geography and inhabitants, and an early critique of Spanish colonialism from a Jewish perspective. Cohen felt that he had something important to say, but even though Italy was the world's leading center for Hebrew printing, he could not publish his work. Still, Cohen was determined that it should survive, and he spent the next 10 years copying and recopying his book by hand. In fact, he copied it 9 times. So this talk will investigate 2 questions. One, what was the significance of the discovery of the New World for European Jews? So how did Jews, a European population that in Spain had been severely oppressed, assess Spanish conquest and colonial violence? And 2, why could an early modern Jewish author not publish work on the Americas, one of the most pressing issues of his day? And then how did Cohen try to save his work by publicizing it despite his inability to publish? Josefa Cohen, the famous writer and historian, is the author of Emek HaBacha, The Valley of Tears. He was born in 1496 in Avignon, France, to a family expelled from Spain in 1492. In 1501, the young Yosef and his parents moved to Geneva. Although the Maritime Republic had been a port of call for many of the Spanish expellees, very few were allowed to settle in its lands. Nevertheless, Yosef Cohen and his family were among the few lucky Jews given permission to live in the city of Geneva, probably because they were part of an important network of Sephardi merchants. Unlike the neighboring Duchy of Milan, Geneva was not under direct Spanish rule, but both financially and politically, its fate depended on Spain. In addition, Geneva is, to the best of my knowledge, the only city in Italy that never officially allowed Jews to settle within its territories. So the Jews could settle as individuals, but in the eyes of the state, they did not seem to exist as a community. But for Yosef and his family, this does not seem to have been a problem, and they led a relatively happy life in Geneva. In 1503 and 1505, when all the Jews were expelled from the city, Yosef's father, who was a respected physician, negotiated a permission for him and his family to stay. But in 1516, the family's fortunes turned around, and they were expelled from Geneva. And he writes about it in Emek HaBacha, as you can see above. A few years later, in 1522, the new Doge, Antonio Adorno, allowed the Jews to come back to Geneva. Along with his brother-in-law, Yosef ben David, and their families, Yosef Cohen moved back to the city, where all enjoyed a long period of relative tranquility. In 1550, so 30 years later, with the arrival of the Dominican Bonifacio Casale in Geneva, the situation of the Jews took a turn for the worse. Dominican Bonifacio Casale convinced the Doge, Gaspare Bracel Grimaldi, and his council of 8 governors to expel the Jews and to inflict horrendous punishments on those who stayed. So Jewish men who stayed would be sentenced to serve in the galleys, while Jewish women would first receive public lashings and then be sent away with their ears and noses cut off. Yosef unsuccessfully tried to negotiate a permit for him and his family to stay. But that didn't work, and on April 2nd, the Republic expelled all the Jews, including the Cohen family. And again, he talks about it in Emek HaBacha, as you can see. So there's really a memory of expulsion that becomes marked in the family's history and in Jewish history, and also maybe a sense of public humiliation, right? He talks about this being trumpeted on the public square and so on. So Yosef settled in a small town called Voltaggio. He received permission to practice medicine and to travel within 8 miles of the city on the condition that he wore a piece of yellow cloth wrapped around his hat. The 17 years Yosef HaKohen spent in Voltaggio seem to have been relatively quiet ones for him and his family. He was in his early 60s by then. He continued to practice medicine on the side. But this expulsion, the fourth his family endured since being expelled from Spain in 1492, seems to have spurred in him an urgent desire to write. And he started to devote more and more of his time to writing. In a time span of 10 years, he wrote 3 major books. First, he wrote the Chronicles of the King of France and Ottoman, a book on the rivalry between Christendom and Islam. The book was printed in 1554 at the Sabianeta Press, but placed on the index of prohibited books, so censored a few years later. In Domenico Gerosolimiano's comprehensive index of Hebrew books published at the end of the century, Yosef's Chronicles was the only book out of 400 Jewish books to be prohibited in its entirety. So other books, they prohibited some passages, but this one was entirely prohibited, for as Gerosolimiano explained, I quote, "Almost all of it is evil and bitter," end of quote. In the years that followed, HaKohen wrote The Valley of Tears, and Mekabacha, his most famous book, which is a history of the Jews from the destruction of the Second Temple to his day, focused on their persecution. This book was not printed, but he hand-wrote four copies between 1558 and 1563. And at the same time, he was working on his book of New India and book of Fernando Cortés, which dealt with the discovery and conquest of the New World. This book was never printed either, but Yosef hand-wrote 9 copies between 1556 and 1568 when he was expelled from Voltaggio. The Valley of Tears publication in 1855, so almost 300 years after Yosef died, established him as a major Jewish historian. However, his other books remained relatively unknown. Moshe Lazar edited the books of New India and Fernando Cortés for the first time only in 2002, based on the 1568 manuscript. And this relative lack of scholarship on HaKohen's American writings is surprising, not only because the question of how early modern Europeans viewed the Americas has received significant scholarly attention, but also because as a Sephardi Jew and refugee, he brings a distinctive perspective to the table. So these books are commonly called a translation of Francisco de Gomara's books on Columbus and Cortés. Gomara was Cortés's personal secretary. He published his 2 books on Columbus and Cortés in 1553. And HaKohen wrote at the beginning of his book that he heard about those books and asked an acquaintance to bring them to him from Spain. Gomara was clearly the inspiration. However, HaKohen's books are not an exact translation, but rather a complex amalgamation of translation of Gomara's work and also political criticism of Spain. His books follow the order of Gomara's work, but some chapters are omitted or shortened, while others are lengthened, and he departs from Gomara's text in a number of different ways. At times, it seems he simply tries to make the text more relevant to his reader. For example, in chapter 30, Gomara writes that in the Americas there's a very large bird, and that bird shines light at night. And the bird shines so much light at night that women can sit around it and sew clothes. HaKohen also writes about this bird in chapter 20, but he imagines an audience of avid readers, maybe like him, and so he says, and this bird makes so much light that you can sit next to it and read a book at night. Often the changes he brings to the text are frankly political and critical of Spanish colonialism. For example, when Gomara accused natives, which he calls Indians, of idolatry, Yosef HaKohen clarified that, I quote, "They themselves, the Spaniards, also believe in statues and idols," end of quote. And to Gomara's description of the Spaniards' forced conversions of Indians, HaKohen added, I quote again, remember the cruelty of the Catholic kings against the Jews. End of quote. As Martin Jacobs has pointed out, HaKohen feels superior to the natives because they are idolaters, whereas he, a Jew, believes in the one true God. But his attitude is complex. First, he reproduces a lot of Gomara's claims, for example, including, for example, that the Indians were cannibals. But later, for example, in a section on Peru, he writes that natives were intelligent people and men of science, even though they were pagans. So there is some mixed evaluation there, and throughout he consistently empathizes with the natives based on the fact that they, like Jews, were victims of Spanish intolerance and oppression. Sometimes HaKohen uses his own medical knowledge to correct Gomara. For example, in chapter 29, entitled that the buboes disease came from the Indies, and here I have both texts side by side. So first you have Gomara's text, and then HaKohen's. Gomara argues that syphilis came to Europe from the Americas because Spanish soldiers had slept with Indian women. And this was a popular theory at the time because the first recorded epidemic occurred in Naples in 1494. But HaKohen seems to question the course of the epidemic. At least in the title, he doesn't says that the disease came from the Indies. He calls it French disease. Then he has a section that reproduces Gomara's retracing of the origins of the disease and how it came from the Americas to Europe. But then in the end, and that's what I wrote down there in blue, he adds a section on smallpox, and he says that, right, it's the Spaniards who brought smallpox to the Americans. So it is clear that he had additional and more correct sources of information. David Watts from the University of Oregon suggested that he completely reversed the course of the disease, the course of syphilis, and argued that it came from France, but I'm not so sure. The way I read it, HaKohen is willing to believe that Native American women had syphilis. However, he suggests at the same time that the disease may have had a European origin too, which is in fact the current medical consensus. Scientists aren't sure where it came from first. Moreover, he adds that Europeans brought smallpox and measles to the Americas with disastrous consequences, a fact that Gomara completely ignores. His usage of an Arabic word might suggest that perhaps he had had access to an Arabic medical manual. His contempt for Columbus and the entire Spanish colonial enterprise comes through perhaps most clearly when he describes Columbus's coat of arms. And Gomara tells us the coat of arms right had an inscription that said, "Por Castilla y por León, Nuevo Mundo halló Colón." So for Castile and for León, Columbus found a new word. And HaKohen starts by mistranslating the inscription because he says, "Por Castilla y por León, medio el mundo halló Colón." So for Castile and for León, Columbus found half the word. So he replaces new with half, denying the novelty of Columbus's discovery. And then he says then he tells his reader that he, Yosef HaKohen, composed his own verse for Columbus. So Gomara doesn't have a verse at all, he only has the inscription, but HaKohen adds the verse that you can see there, right? For Castile and for Leon, Columbus found a new world, but with the passage of the sun through the sky, they crossed into the valley of Ayalon. There he earned eternal fame, for there he also found a dwelling, or maybe a colony. Thus many nations were humbled in great reproach, contempt and dishonor, for this man crossed there to become the malign parasite to their oak. Thus he adds that Columbus didn't only found, but also conquered, or at least settled in a new world. That conquest is likened to Joshua's conquest of the valley of Ayalon, for which God extended the day. So there is a suggestion that perhaps God was on Columbus's side. And yet, he ends the verse very harshly by reproaching him the humiliation of the natives and calling Columbus a parasite. So the book was never printed, but Yosef himself copied it 9 times. The entire manuscript has 300 folios, so 600 pages. 5 of the 9 manuscripts have survived. It's quite unusual to have autographed manuscripts by early modern authors, so to have 5 of them is exceptional. So why did Hakan copy this book by hand instead of printing it? After all, he printed his Chronicles of France and Ottoman, and Italy, where he lived, was a center for Hebrew printing. And why did he copy it so many times? So last year I traveled to Paris, Berlin, and New York to have a look at these manuscripts, and it immediately struck me that these are beautiful finished manuscripts, not drafts or partial copies. Hakan always bought the same paper based on the watermark. He lined the pages, numbered the quires, carefully calligraphed the text before having it bound in thick parchment. Based on these codicological observations, it looks as if he tried to reproduce the process of printing by having the books be as identical to one another as possible. I think the reason he did not print the book is that he could not. The Counter-Reformation Church and the Inquisition were actively censoring books, especially Jewish books, which they accused of blasphemy. In 1553, there had been a trial of the Talmud in nearby Cremona, which, in addition to the tragedy of book burning, had bankrupted the Hebrew printing industry of that town. Yosef knew about it because he wrote about it in Mekabacha. And yet, at the same time, printing Talmuds was a flourishing business in Italy in those years. As Amnon Raz-Krakotkin has shown, Jewish printers and inquisitors collaborated to produce versions that would pass the inspection by the censors. Even though inquisitors worried about blasphemy against Christianity, they still wanted to preserve Hebrew religious writings. They were intensely curious about them and thought that they were valuable. Jews understood this, and the two groups worked together to continue producing those books. That this didn't happen with Yosef's writings suggests not only that his writings were too critical of Christianity, but also maybe that there was little interest on the part of Hebrew printers to print historical works and analysis of contemporary geography and politics. Still, Yosef believed that it was very important that Jews understood the world around them, and so he copied his work 9 times, and he stopped only in 1568 when he was again expelled and moved to a new town. The multiple exiles that he had endured throughout his life had taken a toll. The practice of writing and obsessively copying his work in Hebrew may have been related to this life of exile. Maybe the act of relentlessly and slowly putting pen to paper or quill to paper may have been soothing and meditative. Second, the fact that he wrote in Hebrew, even though his audience probably knew Spanish and Italian better, also shows the importance of identity and culture, perhaps especially when one's lived reality is precarious. Hakan was at ease in many cultures, but when it came to writing, he did it in Hebrew for a Jewish audience. He taught his audience about Spain's new imperial and colonial ventures, but did so in a Jewish language and with an outsiders or Jewish take on the events. And finally, in a world of frequent forced exiles and dislocations, it was important to understand the broad forces that can influence one's life, and he was trying to bring this knowledge to young generations of Jews. Hakan's intellectual approach to Spanish imperialism was complex. Like many Sephardi Jews, he felt a certain affinity to Spanish culture, and knowing Spanish and being Sephardi was an important aspect of his identity. But at the same time, Spain had expelled his family. And as a Jew and a refugee from Spanish intolerance himself, he identified with Native Americans and could not stop his anger and contempt at Spain from shining through the text. This mixture of superiority and compassion toward natives, but contempt towards Spain, constitutes a unique Jewish perspective on developments in the New World. Thank you.